There's been a lot of buzz around, the first sort of suborbital flights that Jeff Bezos and, Richard Branson from Virgin Galactica did recently in July. I think that was essentially a very landmark event. I think ever since, the late 60s. And that has opened up a lot of speculation around space tourism as it would exist pertaining to the larger audiences, right? So we're now looking at the possibility where space travel is no more restricted just to sort of astronauts and, sort of qualified individuals, but we're looking at people who are your everyday people. Obviously, at this stage, it is a little more restricted to the fairly elite because of the cost associated with space tourism. But from our perspective, it was something really interesting, and we wanted to understand what the UAE sort of general population thought of it, what their understanding was about what space travel and tourism is about, and what sort of interest there is. So the findings are actually quite interesting. I'd like to share a brief presentation that actually runs through some of the key KPIs that we found. So this was a brief piece that we did that ran a survey amongst over 1,000 respondents in the UAE. These were people who are representative of the adult population in the UAE. So we essentially mirrored the population proportions when it came to nationality, age, gender, as well as emirate. So before we look into the findings, I think it's good to sort of get an understanding of what exactly space tourism is. And while the majority of people actually think that it is just going to space, space tourism actually is any sort of commercial activity that is related to space. So that could be going to space or watching a launch take place, or actually traveling to any sort of destination or place that is actually hosted around the theme of space. Very briefly, we've come a really long way since 1969, landing on the moon. Ever since then, space tourism conceptually came about in the 70s. And then in the 80s, we actually had the first sort of non-astronauts. So these were teachers and professors that actually went to space. 90s was pretty uneventful when it came to actually space tourism. And then 2000 was when we actually had the first space tourist that went there. Interestingly, he paid $20 million for 8 days on the International Space Station. And then finally, since 2010, that's when actually space tourism as an industry, what we would typically define as an industry, really took off. And the likes of Blue Origin, SpaceX, Virgin Galactica, these are companies that actually came to the forefront. So where is space tourism today? Like I mentioned earlier, in July in this year, we had the first sort of suborbital flights by Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos. And this has sort of set the stone, the stage for what it's going to mean for, getting it to the masses, right? One thing you have to understand is Blue Origin and Virgin Galactica actually offer suborbital flights. So these are actually where you just go to the edge of space. You're high enough to be considered in space, whereas SpaceX is positioned more towards a sort of ultra aspirational, multi-day sort of trip where you're going in orbit and you're spending multiple days in space. All these companies have actually positioned themselves to be offering these within the next 2 years. So Blue Origin and Virgin Galactica are aiming by 2022, they will have up to about 400 flights per year. And SpaceX is, until as lofty as the ambition may sound, it is by 2024. With all these companies sort of positioning this offering, we beg the question that how much does it cost to actually go to space as a tourist? Now, you don't need to be really a genius to figure out how, the ticket sizes are extremely through the ceiling. So depending on the flight and the provider that you're going with, they can range anywhere from 125,000 by space perspective, all the way to 55 million for SpaceX for long multiple day trips. With that sort of background, we thought it would be really interesting to see what the sort of consumer perspective is when it comes to space travel. So in terms of general awareness of space tourism, it is a relatively high sort of phenomenon, with about 61%, the majority saying that they were aware of what space tourism was. However, we feel because it's a fairly new phenomenon and it's a novelty sort of experience, there was only about 20% that actually said that they're very familiar. The large majority actually reported saying that they're only somewhat familiar with what space tourism is. Nevertheless, despite the lack of information, if costs were not a barrier, obviously, because that's something that would be restricting it only to a specific socioeconomic classification, we do find well over half of UAE residents would be very keen to actually book a suborbital space flight. So we see that clearly in the data. In terms of their reasons to go for, of course, they are, like I said, the novelty aspects of traveling to space. So they range from wanting to experience something unique, being able to view the Earth from a never before perspective, being able to see the open space as well as weightlessness. And for most, it is for about a quarter of them, it's just a lifelong dream of having to do something that's completely not done before. So a lifelong dream or aspiration. While there are these sort of strong sort of inclinations to do this, those also are accompanied by certain concerns around safety, right? Generally, we find if people were to be deterred from traveling to space, about a third believe that it would just not be easy, something that would be extremely challenging physically. There is a sort of perception that a large amount of involvement or training would be obviously required. And of course, there is the sort of financial aspect. So utilizing their money, this is a wish list where it currently is. So while the offering is not yet open to the masses, given the current situation where money is a major factor, it is not surprising to see people preferring to use their money to a different cause. There are other aspects like, radiation exposure, concerns around environmental impact that space travel cause, and obviously not having support from families in addition to a few others. While there are concerns as well, so there's a little bit of a yo-yo happening. There is strong interest. There are sort of reasons for wanting to go, yet there are concerns around safety. But at the end of the day, space tourism, as we know, it's taken us just over 50 years from, like I said, the first sort of landing on the moon, and now it being a phenomenon where it could be available to the masses, right? So there is a definite perception that there are strong connotations of benefits associated with space tourism. So that's development of technology, furthering education, economic growth. It'll obviously cause a lot more opportunities, as well as technological developments, which will be sort of, shoot-offs from the technology that's developed. So whether that's hypersonic travel, and then generally more accessibility. So a lot of these, as they develop, would also indicate that, through the sort of development of technology, there would be an economically viable option of traveling to space, which is something that would be an added advantage for those not able to do so. And finally, in the next 10 years, there is a large majority that actually believe that people will routinely travel in space as tourists. So we actually see that clearly. There's a very small proportion, that just over 10%, that actually believe that it will not be the case. But by and large, we do see that there is a openness and expectation actually within the market for this specific sector to develop considerably. So that's just a brief overview of the findings that we did. Specifically in the UAE as well, we are sort of geared towards space tourism, as you rightly said. It's there's a lot of elements that are actually working that indicate that UAE is on the forefront as well. So, for instance, it was about a year and a half ago that UAE was the first country in the Middle East to actually pass a space law that allowed private sector participation. There is a just over 7% investment by Mubadala in Virgin Galactic. So there's a partnership element going there. And then we have the likes of other smaller companies like a Spanish startup, EOS SpaceX, that has sort of plans to launch operations from the Emirate of Dubai. So overall, we're sort of poised at a very interesting phase. It's probably the cusp of how things will sort of take off, and with the players there with really ambitious plans, as well as the initiative by countries like our own, the UAE. This is definitely an industry that would appear to grow significantly in the short term. I think just from what all the indicators show, that as sort of technology improves, this will be something that will be highly accessible. Maybe not in the next 10 years. Maybe we might be looking at a time period slightly longer than that. But as we sort of know, technology sort of is an exponential, there is development, right? So it took us sort of 50 years to get here. Going further from here may happen in a lot less. It doesn't necessarily have to take us 50 years. It might be as short as 15 or 10 years. So that's something definitely we all can look forward to.